Thank you all for coming. If you're just coming in, please sign in. And if you don't have a name tag at your convenience, just walk back there, get a name tag. It makes it easier for everyone. For those of you who haven't met me yet, I'm Peter Buxton. And this is, I think, the end of the 7th year that we have been doing this, the Republican Roundtable. Whatever you think of the Vietnam War, whatever you think of war in general, whatever you think of mankind and mankind's foolishness and how we try to govern ourselves and how often we fail and why we always fail in the same ways over and over again, history is a sad teacher of this sort of lesson. Whatever you think of war or Vietnam, you will find when you read the history of Vietnam that it came to a messy conclusion. And it could have gone on as a greater mess for a much longer time. Would we have won the war in Vietnam? No one can prove that, at least not to my satisfaction. Would we have absolutely lost, and would the communists have landed in Hawaii? I rather doubt it. Were there dominoes ready to fall, one right after the other? Was Thailand going to be overwhelmed? Well, it wasn't, but Cambodia certainly was. And I saw Cambodia about a year before it went under. And I've got to tell you, that really hurt, because Cambodia was a wonderful place. I couldn't believe it. After I left Saigon, where you'd have to watch one way or another. You never knew what was going to happen. They had these little French taxis tearing around. They'd go right over your toe if you weren't careful. If you got in and didn't know what you were doing, they'd take all your money for taking you halfway across town when it should have been something like $2.50. And I once saw in the streets of Saigon a couple of sergeants from the South Vietnamese Airborne trying to grab a taxi, and they'd wave at every taxi that went by, and the taxi driver wouldn't look at them because they could cheat an American for 10 times what they could get from an armed South Vietnamese. I couldn't believe it. This one guy, at one point, he pulled out his .45, pulled it back, threw out a live round, and fired a round right over the hood of the next passing taxi, doing about 20 miles an hour. And the next thing, this taxi driver floored it. It just took off, and the bullet, God knows where the bullet went. But that was Saigon. And then I went to Cambodia, and there was a sweet and peaceful country. I came in on the airplane, and there were very few people coming in at that time. And there was a beautiful Australian nurse who came in on the same plane, and she and I got to be friends, and we said, let's rent a car together. And somebody said, you need some money, and this man had been the taxi driver that brought us in, and I said, oh, here's whatever. I give him some money. He said, I'll be back in a minute. He walked off with my money. And I was sitting there drinking some cold tea, and 10 minutes later he came back and gave me the change, the correct change, and I gave him like $1 as a tip. And that was Cambodia. And it was a wonderful place, and you know what happened there. So that is by way of introduction to a person who had access to the top levels of planning. After being a Marine Corps officer, after having spent 2 years in the top echelons in Vietnam, I won't explain more details because I'll get them wrong. I've gotten them off the internet, and I know there's errors there, and we have the source here, and he will tell you in a moment about this. But my invitation for you and for Daniel is for us to get together and hear a person who was there. And my invitation is to please, Daniel, tell us what you would like to tell us about Vietnam and what you would like to tell us about today. Welcome, please, Daniel Ellsberg.
Well, I was thinking, listening to the introduction, I don't plan really to talk a lot about Vietnam, I must say. There's a lot to talk about right now, and I want to get to that in a second. But it is true that I would not have been studying Vietnam with the Pentagon Papers if I'd not been in Vietnam for 2 years and seen it very close up, seen the war very close up. And that would not have happened as a civilian for 2 years, which I was in the State Department, if I hadn't been in the Marine Corps and hadn't had very good infantry training that I had the chance test out under fire to some extent in Vietnam. You can't hear me still, huh? Got a problem here. How about, can you hear?
Just fine.
Okay. Since you said you couldn't hear, can I urge you to come up? Thank you, thank you. I wouldn't have been in the Marine Corps if it hadn't been for the Korean War, not the Vietnam War. And I was enjoying talking here to Marv Pfeffer, who saw the Korean War as a Marine very close up. I got in 1954 into the Marine Corps when the fighting was pretty well over. I got a ribbon for the Korean emergency, but Marv and others had fought that war in the cold to a standstill, at least, and I didn't have to go to Korea. I wouldn't have been in Korea, as I say, unless Harry Truman, who I then revered, and I revere him less now actually in contrast to a lot of other people, looking back on it, had not sent Marines and other troops, American troops, to Korea without benefit of a congressional declaration of war, which was the first time that a president had really committed us to a major conflict other than repelling a raid or some kind of a very small intervention in Mexico or elsewhere, without a declaration of war by Congress, as the Constitution envisions and requires. And I recall that the person who led the fight or criticism of that action was a man then known as Mr. Republican, Robert Taft, who was not actually a hero of mine at that time. But I look back and see that when Taft said that this was a precedent that would be very dangerous, that it was unconstitutional, what Truman was doing, and that this was a part of the Constitution that should not be negated or ignored. I didn't pay too much attention to that. Coming out of World War II, very patriotic, young American. I was 10 at Pearl Harbor. I'm 76 now. I remember that day very well. Revered the commander-in-chief, FDR, during the war. Grew up on newsreels and as I was growing up. And I wasn't too concerned about who got us into a war against what seemed to be, what was, in fact, clear-cut aggression. I grew up, in other words, believing that the United States opposed aggression, that that's what brought us into the Second World War, and that the mission that Truman described, essentially of a police force, he chose to call it a police action, to obscure the unconstitutional aspects of what he was doing, that sounded like a good mission for the United States. And as I say, the criticism was largely from Taft and a few other Republicans, and I tended to discount that mistakenly. Taft was right. It not only was unconstitutional, but that was part of the Constitution that should not have been amended or rejected. The Constitution, we all know, was not a perfect document. It allowed for amendment, and it needed some amendment on slavery in particular. It got the amendments. And it had other provisions that were not, even to this day, are not perfect. But it had some very, very good inventions in it that I've come to appreciate much more than I did when I was 19, when the Korean War started. So having been, unlike Marv here, I was in college. I was deferred for a couple of times. He went right out of high school. Having been deferred, having no interest in the military up till then, I was studying economics at Harvard, and had graduate, I was deferred in one part for a graduate fellowship to Cambridge, England, Cambridge University. I was not drawn to the military at all. I foresaw an academic life and intellectual life pretty much. But I did approve of the cause of repelling aggression, and felt that someone else had gone in my place since I'd been deferred for a couple of years, so it was my turn to go, that I should go. So I volunteered for the Marine Corps. I could have avoided one way or another, as most of my friends at Harvard actually did, one way or another. But I went in the Marines in '54, just when Marv was getting out in '54, it so happens, and was in for 2 years, But I extended for a third year because my battalion was slated to go to the Middle East with the Sixth Fleet. It's always a Marine battalion in the Mediterranean. And I could have missed that easily enough, but that didn't appeal to me that much. But we had been given briefings, secret briefings, which was unusual for us Marines, that conflict was likely over Suez. And of course, the Suez crisis did ensue. We got involved in it in a particular way. I could mention for a moment, but let me just mention about why I felt it was so important for me to be with my battalion. I had been at one point the operations officer in charge of training, assistant operations officer of the battalion. And at that point, I couldn't stand the thought that my company, and I had been in charge of the commander of a rifle company as a first lieutenant. I was the only first lieutenant in the 2nd Marine Division who had a rifle company. I kept it for about 3 months only, where there were majors and captains trying to get it away from me to get it on their record. That was probably the most satisfying 3 months of my professional life, most satisfying professional experience I ever had. And before that, I'd been a platoon leader, which I also loved, but company commander was a wonderful command. And I even thought if I could stay as a company commander and never be a major carrying around a clipboard and working for a colonel, I would stay in. I actually gave thought to that. But you can't do that. In the Mediterranean, interestingly, the Suez crisis did occur, and at one point we were sailing toward the southeast corner of the Mediterranean, the juncture of Suez and Egypt and Israel. Israel and England and France, having conspired, I'll just give you a 1-minute background on the Suez crisis. Some of you are old enough to remember and others are not. Having conspired, in a very literal sense, to provoke, to give themselves an excuse to invade the Suez Canal and retake it from Egypt, which had nationalized it. And as the training officer at that point of the battalion, I was asked to get a little background on the Suez crisis and brief it to the officers on the ships, which I did. I went from ship to ship talking about the background. So we had encyclopedias on the ship, in the ship's library, and some books, few books, and I read what I could. And to my amazement, discovered that as far as I could tell, Nasser had every legal right to nationalize the canal, that he hadn't committed aggression of doing that. And that the British efforts against that were very clearly colonial, or the last colonial gasp. So, to jump over a lot of other things, when the British and French bombed Port Said, the harbor, and then troops landed allegedly to separate Egypt, the Egyptian forces, and the Israeli forces, but actually entirely on the side of Israel. In other words, a great deal of lying went on by the British and French and the Israelis, which angered Eisenhower very much because he was lied to himself. I said we were sailing toward the southeast corner, not knowing who we would be fighting or what we'd be doing. Now, we only had one battalion, and our mission was to take out American refugees, American tourists or officials or whoever, to evacuate them from one country or another. And it was understood that that might not be with the collaboration of the local people. We might have to establish a beachhead and take them out. So we had to do landing plans, and I did a landing plan for Haifa, and the assistant next to me made a landing plan for Alexandria. And we didn't know which the president would order us to use. And I didn't care that much. I was a Marine. We thought of ourselves as the president's men, the president's guard. We were to be used quickly and forcefully wherever the president decided on short notice. That's what was our rationale for having a Marine Corps, which was always under attack by the other services. And whichever the president decided. I assumed that if we had to use my plan against the Israelis, we would be destroyed. That was my image. But if we used my friend's plan for Alexandria, presumably we thought chauvinistically, we'll go through them very easily. As the event wore on, it became clear that Eisenhower was defining this action as aggression in the sense of the UN Charter. It had not been authorized by the UN Security Council. It was not in response to an attack. It was a crime against the peace. And he was making that charge against our closest allies, not just from World War II, but from NATO. Britain, you know, as some of you know probably well, our British and American intelligence services are essentially one, totally coordinated. French, less coordinated by far. He was calling our closest ally an aggressor and saying, you've got to stop. You've got to stop. And he had the financial leverage on that there was a run on the pound at that point, and he said, I will not protect the pound. We won't keep the value of the pound up, which was had looked devastating. And I later met, when I was working at the Rand Corporation, and a member of the Institute of Strategic Studies in England, I met at one of their meetings where we met all the head of Israeli intelligence and the head of British planning for this operation on Suez. And I asked them, in your contingency planning for this operation, did you ever consider the possibility that you would be asked by your government to stop in mid-invasion, which is what they did. They were halfway down the canal, and thanks to Eisenhower, they said, stop, go back, and pull back. He said, never in their nightmares, you know, the thought had never imagined. What military man had ever faced such a thing? But in response to pressure from the US, Britain had to do that. It was their last colonial gasp. The point I wanted to make was that as a very patriotic American working for a Republican commander-in-chief, I was proud of our president. I had not voted for Eisenhower, but I thought, this is wonderful. This is American. This is taking a stand on principle and using the power of the U.S. here, even when our closest allies have transgressed here, basically. And he's standing up for a very important international principle. So I was proud as an American. I was proud of my president as an American and as a Marine. I must say it did not occur to me that, and I'm jumping ahead here, and I'll say something that may be in this group controversial, but to me it's not. It's straightforward. It had not occurred to me that as a citizen of this country, I would see my country engage in aggression against Iraq as clearly in terms of legal terms as was true of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan or Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, which got Bush with my support. Again, I hadn't voted for Bush, but when Bush mustered a coalition of Middle Eastern states against Saddam's invasion of Kuwait as aggression, and they joined that coalition even though they were all in the Arab League, so clear-cut aggression, I thought that was a good, sound approach. And to find that we were taking an action that was, you know, there are many things people say about it, all true, critical things. Ill-planned, ill-conceived, disastrous. Perhaps some people here will want to discuss that later or disagree with me, but ill-planned, there are not too many disagreements with that. McCain makes that point on every speech. But beyond that, a crime against the peace. Now, Vietnam was very badly done and involved a great deal of lying, and not a high point. It was not, for reasons I won't take time to go into now, as clear-cut aggression, certainly in the minds of the American people or me when I went there. The people that went with me to Vietnam were as idealistic about what we were doing as the 17 or the 19-year-olds who go to Iraq today, who are going there in the belief that they are responding to the country that attacked us on 9/11, wrong. In the belief that Saddam was closely connected to Al-Qaeda, wrong. In the belief that they were sent there to spread democracy and bring that about, I would say misguided, and certainly not having that effect. But in terms of what they think they're doing, they're very idealistic. And people don't realize, who aren't old enough, that we went to Vietnam in much the same spirit. We were supporting a supposed democracy against the subversion and attack by communists. My entire professional career for 20 years was fighting communists, trying to contain communists, trying to avoid, above all, a nuclear attack by the communists. That was my particular specialty until I worked on Vietnam. So the idea of opposing communists, I never had any question about, and indeed, to this day, I totally sympathize with those Vietnamese who did not want to be governed, would prefer not to be governed by communists. They were on sound ground on that. But, as I say, in the case of Iraq, you had this problem that it was very like the British-French attack on Suez, and I had not foreseen that my country would be doing that. In between, of course, I'd gone through a good deal of evolution. Not in my attitude toward communism, which then and now I see, as a totally tyrannical, despotic regime, and many other things you can say about it as well. Murderous, especially under Stalin, and a police state. So, but in my attitude toward not so much the United States, but toward presidential power, the idea of unchecked presidential power, which Taft warned against rightly, I came to see, one way of putting it was, I came to see that Taft had been right in 1950, even if Korea were worth fighting. But to do it without congressional declaration, without authorization, was a bad precedent and served us very badly on Vietnam and Iraq and the future. So forth. Now, that was a Democratic president, of course. Let me move ahead to, I worked, as I say, on nuclear weapons for years, but I'm not going to, I could talk about that, but I won't take the time tonight. I will mention that under Eisenhower, I became a specialist in the command and control of nuclear weapons and the design of nuclear war plans. It just occurred to me that I spent Christmas season, about 10 days around Christmas, of 1960, away from my family, in Washington working for Secretary of Defense Gates. In fact, I thought of it tonight. Unless I have the name wrong, and I could do that now at my age. Same name as the current defense secretary, it never occurred to me. I don't think there's any relation. But anyway, working on the question of delegation or devolution, they called it, of presidential authority in the event of a nuclear attack. How to maintain presidential or something like presidential control of nuclear weapons if the president himself had been destroyed in an attack on Washington. And as I say, there's that planning is somewhat in the news, or it should be more in the news now. An awful lot of planning has been going on like that ever since, now related to terrorist attack, which of course is possible, or to civil disturbances of other kinds defined by the president, which call for a degree of martial law in the eyes of the current president, and he didn't start that planning. And I'll pass over that, as I say. In 1964, in order better to understand the workings of the government that might lead to a nuclear war,